My husband told his mother I was just the help with benefits at their family dinner. I smiled and said, "Then consider this my resignation." For 8 years, I'd been the invisible engine keeping his perfect life running, the one who scheduled his meetings, ironed his shirts, and made him look like a functional adult while he took credit for my organizational skills at work parties. So when he made that comment to his mother while I was serving dessert, I'd spent 6 hours making from scratch. Something inside me finally broke. I filed for separation that Monday, and started my own virtual assistant business with the contacts I'd built managing his career. First, he didn't even notice I'd left until Sunday night when he came home to an empty fridge and no clean underwear for Monday. He called me 23 times, not because he missed me, but because he couldn't find his lucky golf socks. Week 1, he showed up to 3 wrong meetings because he never learned how to read his own calendar. His biggest client called his boss, asking if everything was okay after he missed their quarterly review completely. He tried to blame a technical glitch, but his boss knew better. His assistant at work quit after he asked her to pick up his dry cleaning and organize his home office. She reported him to HR for inappropriate requests outside her job description. Week 2, his car got towed because he didn't know I'd been moving it every Tuesday for street cleaning. The towing fee was $450, plus the 4 parking tickets he'd accumulated were another $280. He tried to contest them but didn't know where to find the registration paperwork I'd always handled. His credit card got declined at a business lunch because he'd never paid attention to payment due dates. I'd been managing all the bills through autopay from my laptop. Without the passwords I'd changed, he was lost. His clients watched him fumble with his wallet for 10 minutes before his colleague had to cover the $400 tab. In month 1, his mother called me crying because her precious son looked homeless. His shirts were wrinkled, his hair was too long because he didn't know which barber I'd been booking, and he'd been eating gas station food for 3 weeks. She begged me to just help him get back on track. I told her the help doesn't work for free and hung up. Meanwhile, my business was thriving. 3 of his former colleagues hired me immediately after hearing I was available. They'd watched me basically run his career from behind the scenes for years. Within 6 weeks, I was making double what I'd made at my old part-time job I'd quit to support his career. His boss pulled him aside after he showed up to a board meeting in a wrinkled shirt with 2 different shoes. Apparently, he'd been trying to dress himself in the dark because he couldn't figure out which light switch controlled the closet light. The same closet I'd organized by color and occasion for 8 years, he was put on performance improvement after missing 4 deadlines in a row. Turns out, I'd been the one tracking all his projects on a spreadsheet he didn't even know existed. His team started calling him the weak link in group messages he didn't realize I'd been managing from his phone. Month 2, the house looked like a disaster zone. He'd tried to do laundry and mixed reds with whites, turning his entire wardrobe pink. He attempted to hire a housekeeper, but 3 different services refused to come back after seeing the state of the bathroom. One actually took photos for their company chat as a warning to other employees. His brother had to drive over and teach him how to use the coffee maker I'd been operating every morning at 5:30 a.m., so his coffee would be perfect when he woke at 6. The brother posted about it in their family group chat, and his cousin started calling him helpless baby as a joke. Except it wasn't really a joke anymore. He tried hiring a personal assistant through an agency. She lasted exactly 3 days before quitting via email, citing that he expected wife services at employee prices. The agency blacklisted him and warned other agencies in the area. He had to explain to his mother why 5 different services wouldn't take his calls. Last month, divorce papers were served at his office. He called me screaming that I was ruining his life. I reminded him that I was just the help, and help doesn't usually get half of everything in divorce settlements. His lawyer told him to take the deal I was offering because judges don't look kindly on husbands who publicly humiliate their wives while those wives are serving homemade tiramisu to their mothers. Yesterday, his mother called again. This time, she wasn't crying. Her voice sounded different on the phone, not sad or angry, just calm and steady like she was calling to schedule a dentist appointment. She asked if I could meet her for coffee sometime this week, just the 2 of us, and something about the way she said it made me curious enough to agree. We picked a cafe halfway between our places for Thursday morning. I got there first and grabbed a table by the window, ordering a black coffee while I waited. She walked in 10 minutes later looking more worn out than I'd ever seen her. The woman who always had perfect makeup and ironed clothes looked like she'd been up all night doing laundry, which turned out to be exactly what had happened. She ordered us both refills and sat down across from me with a heavy sigh. And then she told me she'd been doing his laundry for the past 3 weeks because he'd destroyed everything he owned. The pink clothes incident was just the start. He'd shrunk his work pants, melted a synthetic shirt in the dryer, and somehow got bleach stains on his only decent suit jacket. She'd been driving over every Sunday to wash and fold his clothes because he couldn't figure out the machine even after she wrote down instructions. I didn't say anything, just sipped my coffee and waited for whatever came next. She stared at her cup for a long minute before admitting she hadn't realized how much I did, until she started trying to help him survive basic adult tasks. She said the exact words I'll never forget. I raised him wrong, and then you fixed what I broke, and now we're both paying for it. Her voice cracked a little on the last part, but she didn't cry. I could tell she'd done her crying already, probably while folding his pink dress shirts at midnight. She wasn't there to ask me to come back, or even to help him get his life together. She was apologizing for dismissing everything I'd contributed all those years. She said she always thought I was lucky to have married her successful son, that he was such a catch with his good job and nice house. But now she could see he was the lucky one, and she'd been too blind to notice. I accepted her apology because it felt real, not like she was trying to manipulate me into doing something. We ended up talking for 2 hours about everything. She told me stories about his childhood that explained so much. How she'd always picked up his room because it was faster than teaching him. How his dad never made him do chores because boys should focus on the school and sports. How she'd packed his lunch every day through high school even when his friends were making their own. She'd created this helpless person, and then been shocked when he expected his wife to do the same things his mother had done. By the time we left the cafe, I understood her better, and she understood what she'd put me through by raising him that way. That afternoon, Pearl called with news that made me smile. My ex's lawyer wanted to speed up the settlement talks because apparently living in complete chaos while paying for both my apartment and his mortgage was draining his savings way faster than he'd expected. Pearl sounded amused when she told me this. The man who'd always been so proud of his financial planning skills was running out of money because he couldn't handle basic life tasks. A few days later, his lawyer sent over an actual proposal through Pearl. He was offering me 40% of everything plus spousal support for 2 years. Pearl looked at the numbers and said it was more reasonable than she'd expected, which probably meant he was desperate. And she told me we should counter with 50% and 3 years, because that's what I actually deserved after 8 years of unpaid labor. I agreed, and she sent back our counteroffer that same day. While all this legal stuff was happening, my business hit a huge milestone. Helga referred me to her entire book club, and suddenly I had 6 new clients in 1 week. These women all needed help managing their busy lives, and they'd heard through Helga that I was amazing at it. I had to start turning down work because I was at capacity. I couldn't take on any more clients without either working myself to death or hiring help. So I decided to hire help. I found a college student who needed flexible hours and had great social media skills. She was perfect for handling the parts of client work that didn't need my personal attention. Teaching her my systems made me realize how much real expertise I actually had. I'd spent so long thinking of myself as just someone who was naturally organized, but I'd actually developed detailed processes for everything. I had systems for email management, calendar optimization, task prioritization, and project tracking. I'd built all of this while managing my ex's life, and now I was teaching someone else to use these same methods. It felt good to see my knowledge valued like this. Then on Friday evening, my ex showed up at my apartment building without any warning. The doorman called up to my unit asking if I wanted to see him. I walked over to my window and looked down at the entrance. He was standing there in wrinkled clothes with his hair sticking up, arguing with the security guard about why he needed to come up. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him. Worse even than when his mom had called crying about him looking homeless. I told the doorman I didn't want to see him and to please ask him to leave. I watched from my window as the security guard delivered this message. My ex started gesturing wildly, probably trying to explain why it was so important that he talk to me right now. The guard just shook his head and pointed toward the street. After about 5 minutes of this, my ex finally gave up and walked back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat for another 10 minutes, probably hoping I'd change my mind and come down. I didn't. I just went back to my laptop and kept working on a client project. That night around 11, an email from my ex landed in my inbox with the subject line, "We need to talk." I opened it because Pearl had told me to forward her anything he sent. The first 3 paragraphs were angry, accusing me of abandoning him and making his life impossible on purpose. Then it shifted to bargaining, offering to go to counseling or take a break instead of divorcing. The last paragraph was different. He admitted he never appreciated what I did, and didn't realize how much work went into keeping his life running smoothly. But then he added that he could learn all this stuff if he just had time, like managing a household was some skill you picked up in a weekend workshop. I forwarded it to Pearl without responding and went to bed. 3 days later, Pearl called to set up an in-person meeting with Ashton Larkin at a conference room downtown. She told me my ex wouldn't be there because Ashton had advised him to stay away. Apparently, every time he talked to his own lawyer, he made things worse by getting defensive, or trying to minimize what he'd done wrong. I met Pearl outside the building and we rode the elevator up together. She had a leather folder full of documents and looked completely calm, like this was just another Tuesday for her. Ashton was already in the conference room when we walked in. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, wearing a suit that looked expensive. He stood up and shook our hands, then we all sat down at the long table. Pearl opened her folder and pulled out a spreadsheet showing all our assets and debts. Ashton had his own copy, and they started going through it line by line. The house was worth more than we paid for it, but needed major repairs that would cost at least $20,000. My ex wanted to keep it, which was fine with me because I didn't want to deal with fixing all the problems I'd been asking him to address for years. Pearl pushed for 50% of everything plus 3 years of spousal support. Ashton countered with 40% and 2 years. They went back and forth for almost an hour while I sat there watching them negotiate my future like it was a business deal, which I guess it was. We settled on 45% of assets, 3 years of spousal support paid quarterly, and he keeps the house with all its problems. I get the newer car because I'd been the one maintaining it and keeping up with oil changes. I also get my business equipment, which he'd paid for initially, but had no idea how to use, plus enough money to put a down payment on my own place. Ashton said he'd draw up the paperwork and send it over for review. Pearl told him we wanted this moving quickly. The mediator came in after Ashton left and spent 30 minutes explaining the waiting period. We had to wait 30 days for everything to be finalized, which is standard for divorce in our state. Pearl warned me on the way out that my ex might try to contact me during this time. She was right. 2 days later, the first bouquet showed up at my apartment. Roses, expensive ones, with a card that said, "I'm sorry, can we talk?" I took a photo of the card and texted it to Pearl. She called me back within 5 minutes and told me to refuse delivery of any future flowers. The next bouquet arrived 3 days later. Lilies this time, with a card saying, "I miss you." I handed it back to the delivery guy and told him to return it to the sender. Pearl sent a formal letter from her office to my ex reminding him that all communication needed to go through our lawyers. The third bouquet showed up 4 days after that. I didn't even look at the card. I just wrote "return to sender" on the delivery slip and sent it back. After that, the flowers stopped. Meanwhile, Veronica Chandler called to invite me to a networking event for small business owners at a hotel downtown. She said it would be good for my business, and she wanted to introduce me to some people. I wore my best professional outfit and showed up feeling nervous but excited. The event was in a big ballroom with maybe 80 people, all standing around with drinks and name tags. Veronica found me right away and started walking me around, introducing me to everyone I met, 2 women who owned a consulting firm and needed help managing their schedules. They hired me right there after hearing how I'd built my business from nothing in under 6 months. I also met a guy who ran a real estate investment company and needed someone to handle his property management paperwork. By the end of the night, I had 5 new potential clients and felt like my business was really taking off. The next morning, my ex-mother-in-law called. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She didn't sound upset this time. Instead, she sounded almost amused when she told me she was making her son take a life skills class at the community center. She described him sitting in a room full of teenagers learning how to iron a shirt properly. One of the kids had asked him why he never learned this stuff before, and he'd apparently said his wife always did it. The instructor had given him a look and told him that was exactly why he was there now. My ex-mother-in-law laughed while telling me this story, like she finally saw how ridiculous the whole situation was. 2 weeks later, I found a condo listing online that made me stop scrolling. It was in a neighborhood I'd always loved, the one with the tree-lined streets and the good coffee shop on the corner. When we were married, my ex had insisted we needed a big house in the suburbs to impress his clients. This condo was perfect for just me. 2 bedrooms with big windows and a small balcony. The mortgage payment was actually less than what I was paying in rent. I called the realtor and scheduled a viewing for that afternoon. Walking through it, I felt something click into place. This was mine. Not ours, not his, just mine. I put in an offer that same day. Pearl helped me review all the condo paperwork before I signed anything. She sat at my kitchen table with reading glasses on, going through every page of the purchase agreement and the inspection report. She pointed out a few things I should negotiate with the seller and helped me write up the requests. When everything came back approved, she watched me sign the final papers. I used money from the settlement for the down payment. Sitting there with the pen in my hand, signing my name on documents that would make me a property owner, felt strange. For 8 years, every major decision had involved considering what he wanted or what would be good for his career. Now I was buying property in my name only, choosing a place because I loved it, not because it impressed anyone. The 30-day waiting period ended on a Tuesday. Pearl called me that morning to tell me the divorce was officially final. I was at my desk working when she called, and I remember looking out my window at the street below, while she explained that all the paperwork had been processed and filed with the court. I didn't feel sad or relieved, just ready. Ready to move forward with the business I'd built, the condo I'd bought, the life I was creating that had nothing to do with managing someone else's incompetence. Pearl asked if I wanted to celebrate, and I told her maybe later. Right now, I had 3 client calls scheduled and a new employee starting tomorrow. The help had moved on to better things. 2 weeks after the divorce papers were final, Dimitri called to invite me to his birthday party. He said the whole family would be there, including my ex, but he wanted me to come anyway because I was still family to him. I almost said no, but decided I had nothing to hide or feel bad about anymore. The party was at Dimitri's house on a Saturday afternoon, and I showed up in a new dress I'd bought with my first big paycheck. Walking in felt strange because I knew most of these people from 8 years of family events, but now I was technically the outsider. Dimitri hugged me at the door and immediately pulled me aside to tell me about my ex's work situation. He said the performance improvement plan had ended last week, and my ex was officially off probation, but the promotion he'd been expecting for 2 years went to someone else on his team. Dimitri tried to look serious while telling me this, but I could see him fighting a smile. He said my ex had apparently complained to their mother that it wasn't fair, and she'd told him life wasn't fair, and he should be grateful he still had a job at all. I thanked Dimitri for the update and walked into the main party area where about 30 relatives were eating and talking. The room got quiet for maybe 5 seconds when people noticed me. Then Dimitri's wife came over and gave me a huge hug. She asked about the business and the condo, and suddenly I was surrounded by people asking questions. My ex was on the other side of the room talking to his cousins, and he looked over once but didn't come near me. His mother was there too, and she gave me a small nod from across the room, which felt like progress. 3 of his cousins asked for my business card because they said they desperately needed help getting organized. One of them told me her home office was a complete mess, and she kept missing deadlines for her freelance work. Another said he was drowning in paperwork for his small business, and couldn't keep track of anything. I gave them all my card, and said to email me to set up a free consultation. By the time I left 2 hours later, I had 5 new potential clients from his own family. The whole thing felt surreal but also kind of perfect. The next Monday, I got an email from a woman named Sarah who'd been working as a virtual assistant for 6 years. She'd seen my job posting online and wanted to apply. We did a video interview that afternoon, and I hired her on the spot because she had way more experience than my first employee and new systems I was still learning. She started the following week and immediately took over the more complicated client accounts. Having 2 employees meant I was actually running a real company now instead of just being a one-person operation working from my laptop. I had to figure out payroll and tax stuff and how to delegate tasks properly. My business coach helped me set up better systems for managing the team. I created a shared calendar and project management software so we could all see what everyone was working on. It felt overwhelming some days, but also exciting because the business was growing faster than I'd expected. Sarah brought in 2 of her own clients who wanted to switch to our company, which added even more revenue. I started looking into renting a small office space because working from my apartment with 2 employees doing video calls was getting cramped. 3 weeks later, I was meeting with Veronica at a coffee shop downtown to go over her quarterly planning. We were sitting at a corner table with our laptops open when I looked up and saw my ex walking toward us. My stomach dropped, but I kept my face calm. He walked right up to our table and said he needed to talk to me. Veronica immediately closed her laptop and stood up. She told him this was a business meeting and he needed to leave. He ignored her and kept looking at me, saying he just wanted 5 minutes. Veronica pulled out her phone and said she was calling the police if he didn't walk away in the next 10 seconds. She started counting out loud, and he finally left, but not before giving me this desperate look that made me feel nothing. Veronica sat back down and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, and we went back to work like nothing had happened. Later that night, Veronica texted to check on me again. I appreciated that she'd stepped in so quickly without making it a big dramatic thing. 2 days after the coffee shop incident, Dimitri called me. He said my ex had asked him to pass along a message and Dimitri wanted to make sure I was okay with hearing it before he said anything. I told him to go ahead. Dimitri said my ex had written out an actual apology, not through his lawyer this time, and wanted Dimitri to read it to me. The apology was specific about what he'd done wrong. He said he'd treated me like an employee he could sleep with instead of like a partner. He admitted he'd taken credit for my work and never appreciated how much I did to keep his life running. He said he was starting therapy twice a week to figure out why he'd acted that way and to learn how to be a better person. Dimitri finished reading and waited for my response. I told him to tell my ex that I heard the apology, but I wasn't going to respond to it. Dimitri understood and said he'd pass that along. After we hung up, I sat on my couch thinking about how I felt. The apology sounded real, and I believed he probably meant it, but I didn't feel the need to acknowledge it or tell him I forgave him. That chapter was closed. I called Pearl the next day to tell her about the apology and ask if I needed to do anything about it legally. She said no, and then she told me something that stuck with me. She said the fact that I felt more indifferent than angry was actually the healthiest possible outcome. She explained that anger keeps you connected to someone, but indifference means you've truly moved on. I hadn't thought about it that way before, but she was right. I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't really feel much of anything about him except maybe a distant hope that he'd figure his life out. Pearl said that was exactly where I should be at this point. We talked for a while about the business and the condo closing that was coming up in 2 weeks. She reminded me that once I closed on the condo, I'd be completely financially independent from my ex except for the spousal support payments. Everything I was building was mine alone. The condo closing happened on a Friday morning in early March. I signed all the papers at the title company office and walked out with keys to my own place. My first employee and Sarah both took the afternoon off to help me move, and 3 friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage showed up with their cars. We spent the whole weekend moving my stuff from the apartment to the condo. The previous owner had left it in perfect condition, so all I had to do was arrange my furniture and unpack boxes. Standing in the middle of my new living room with boxes everywhere and my friends laughing in the kitchen, I felt something shift inside me. This space was completely mine. I'd chosen it, bought it, and filled it with things I actually liked, instead of things that matched his idea of what our home should look like. One of my friends found the box with my kitchen stuff and started putting away dishes while talking about how proud she was of me. She said she'd watched me disappear during my marriage and it was good to see me coming back. That night, after everyone left, I sat on my new couch in my new condo and ordered pizza. The place was still half unpacked, but it already felt more like home than the house I'd lived in for 8 years ever had. The following week, I was reviewing the business finances with my accountant when she told me we'd hit 6 figures in revenue for the year. I stared at the number on the spreadsheet for a full minute trying to process it. In less than a year, I'd built a business that was making more money than I'd ever made managing my ex's entire life for free. My accountant congratulated me and said most new businesses don't see this kind of growth until year 3 or 4. That night, I put on the nicest dress I owned and took myself out to an expensive restaurant downtown. I ordered a steak and a glass of wine and sat there by myself feeling proud. The waiter asked if I was celebrating something, and I told him I was celebrating my business hitting 6 figures. He brought me a free dessert, and the couple at the next table raised their glasses to me. It was one of the best meals I'd ever had. A few days later, I got a LinkedIn message from Jasmine Walton. I recognized her name immediately because she was my ex's boss, the one who'd put him on the performance improvement plan. Her message said she'd been hearing impressive things about my business and wanted to know if I'd be interested in consulting for their company. She said they needed someone to help train their junior executives on organizational systems and time management. I read the message 3 times before responding. The idea of working for my ex's company doing the exact thing he'd taken credit for during our marriage felt almost too perfect. I sent her a professional response saying I'd be interested in learning more, and we scheduled a call for the next day. The call with Jasmine lasted an hour. She explained that she'd watched my ex struggle after I left and realized he'd been relying on skills that weren't actually his. She said several other executives at the company had similar issues with organization and time management, and she wanted to bring in someone to train them properly. We talked about what the consulting work would involve, and she offered me a 6-month contract to develop a training program and run monthly workshops. The pay was more than I charged any of my other clients. At the end of the call, she said something that made me smile. She told me she'd always suspected my ex wasn't as organized as he appeared, and now she knew why. I thanked her for the opportunity and said I'd send over a formal proposal by the end of the week. After we hung up, I sat at my desk thinking about how far I'd come. Less than a year ago, I'd been serving tiramisu to his mother while he called me the help. Now I was about to train executives at his company and get paid extremely well for it. The help had definitely moved on to better things. 2 days after signing the consulting contract with his company, my phone buzzed with a text from my ex. The message was long and bitter, calling me petty and vindictive for taking a job at his workplace just to embarrass him. He said I was rubbing his face in my success and trying to turn his colleagues against him. I read it twice, then took a screenshot and forwarded it to Pearl without responding. She called me back within 10 minutes and told me not to engage with him at all. She sent him a formal email that same afternoon reminding him about the no-contact agreement we'd established during the divorce proceedings. The email was professional but firm, warning him that any further direct contact with me would be documented and could affect the settlement terms. He didn't text again after that. The following week, I met with a business coach named Rebecca, who came highly recommended by Veronica. We sat in a coffee shop for 3 hours going through my business finances, client list, and growth projections. Rebecca kept shaking her head and smiling, telling me that most new businesses don't see this kind of success until year 3 or 4. I'd accomplished in 8 months what typically took people years to build. She helped me map out realistic goals for the next 2 years, including hiring more staff, raising my rates, and potentially expanding into corporate training programs. By the end of our session, I had a clear roadmap for scaling the company properly. Instead of just reacting to whatever opportunities came my way, I signed up for 6 months of coaching sessions and left feeling more confident about the business side of things. 3 weeks later, the first spousal support payment hit my bank account. Pearl had negotiated quarterly payments instead of monthly, so the amount was substantial enough to make me stare at my phone screen for a full minute. I transferred the entire payment directly into a retirement account that afternoon. Pearl had structured the agreement so I'd receive payments for 3 years, which would build a nice nest egg if I invested it all properly. The money felt like validation somehow, like official recognition that my contributions during the marriage had actual monetary value. I met with my financial advisor the next day to make sure the retirement account was set up correctly for long-term growth. The following Saturday, I was pushing my cart through the produce section at the grocery store when I nearly ran into my ex-husband. We both stopped and stared at each other for a second before he said hello. I said hello back, and we stood there awkwardly next to the lettuce display. He looked better than he had months ago when he'd been falling apart. Still not great, but like he was figuring things out slowly. His shirt was clean and matched his pants, and his hair was cut properly. We made small talk about the weather and the grocery store being crowded on weekends. He asked how my business was going, and I said it was going well. I asked how work was, and he said it was getting better. The conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes before I said I needed to finish my shopping. He nodded and told me to take care, then pushed his cart toward the dairy section. As I walked away, I noticed his cart had actual groceries in it instead of just frozen dinners and energy drinks. He was buying vegetables and chicken breasts and pasta, things that required actual cooking. I grabbed my spinach and moved to the next aisle, where I ran into him again near the canned goods. He seemed embarrassed but started talking again, telling me he'd hired a life coach who was helping him learn basic life skills. He also hired a cleaning service that worked with him instead of just doing everything, teaching him how to maintain things between their visits. I could tell he wanted credit for these basic adulting achievements, like he expected me to be impressed that he was learning to clean his own bathroom. I just said that sounded good and moved on with my shopping. He called after me that he was really trying to change, but I was already turning the corner toward the checkout lanes. The next week, my ex-mother-in-law called and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. I agreed, curious about what she wanted to discuss. We met at the same cafe where we'd had our first real conversation months ago, and she told me she'd been thinking about making this a regular thing. She suggested we meet once a month to catch up, just the two of us, with no discussion of her son required. I liked the idea, and we set up a standing date for the first Thursday of every month. Our conversations ranged from books we were reading to her garden to my business growth. She told me about a mystery series she was obsessed with, and I recommended a memoir I'd just finished. She showed me pictures of her new rose bushes, and asked for advice about organizing her home office. It felt strange at first to have this friendship with my ex-mother-in-law, but it also felt natural. She'd become someone I genuinely enjoyed talking to, separate from her role as his mother. During our third monthly coffee date, she told me something that surprised me. She said watching this whole situation unfold had made her examine her own marriage and how much she'd enabled her husband over the years. She'd been doing everything for him the same way I'd done everything for her son, and she never realized it was a problem until she saw the consequences play out with him. She'd started setting boundaries with her husband, making him do his own laundry and cook his own meals when she was busy. She said their relationship was actually improving because he was learning to appreciate what she did instead of just expecting it. I told her it took courage to change patterns that had been in place for decades. She squeezed my hand and said I'd inspired her to expect more from the people she loved. 2 weeks later, I got an email from a podcast producer asking if I'd be interested in speaking about starting a business after divorce. The podcast focused on women rebuilding their lives after major life changes, and the producer had heard about my story through someone in her network. I was nervous about sharing my experience so publicly, but I decided to do it because my story might help other people who felt trapped in similar situations. The interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday over Zoom, and I spent the weekend preparing talking points and practicing what I wanted to say. The actual interview lasted an hour and felt surprisingly easy once we got started. The host asked thoughtful questions about recognizing my worth, setting boundaries, and building something of my own. I talked about the systems I'd developed and how I turned years of invisible labor into a profitable business. I mentioned the tiramisu moment without using names, and the host laughed and said she could relate to that feeling of finally having enough. The episode went live 3 weeks later, and the response was bigger than I expected. My inbox filled with messages from women who'd listened and connected with my story. 3 of them specifically asked to hire me because they'd heard me talk about building systems for independent living. They wanted help organizing their lives as they prepared to leave marriages or rebuild after divorces. My business was growing in a direction I'd never expected, working with women who were in the same position I'd been in a year ago. The same week the podcast episode dropped, I met someone at a networking event for small business owners. We ended up talking for an hour about the challenges of scaling a company, and discovered we had similar approaches to client management. They asked if I wanted to grab dinner sometime to continue the conversation, and I said yes. We went out the following weekend to a Thai restaurant downtown, and the conversation flowed easily from business topics to books to travel. It wasn't serious yet, just a few dinners and some texts throughout the week, but it felt good to spend time with someone who saw me as a whole person. They asked questions about my business with genuine interest and shared their own entrepreneurial struggles. They didn't expect me to manage their calendar or remind them about appointments. They showed up on time, made reservations, and split the check without making it weird. After our third dinner, walking back to my car, I realized I was smiling in a way I hadn't in years. This person wasn't looking for help with benefits. They were looking for an equal partner in whatever this was becoming. A few weeks later, Dimitri called me during his lunch break to share some family gossip. My ex-husband had started dating someone new, and apparently he was being completely honest with her about all his problems from the start. She knew he couldn't cook, couldn't do laundry properly, and needed help with basic household tasks. Dimitri found it funny that his brother was actually learning to make scrambled eggs and pasta under her guidance, instead of just expecting someone to do everything for him. I listened to Dimitri laugh about the cooking lessons and realized I felt nothing about this news. No jealousy, no satisfaction, not even curiosity about who she was or what she looked like. The next day, I caught myself about to open my ex-husband's social media profile out of habit, but I closed the app instead. I hadn't checked his accounts in 3 weeks, and I hadn't asked Dimitri for updates about him in even longer. The need to know what he was doing had just disappeared, replaced by complete disinterest in his daily activities. My business coach noticed this shift during our monthly strategy session. She said I seemed more focused on my own goals instead of looking backward, and she suggested I write a book about organizational systems for busy professionals. The idea excited me immediately because I had years of experience building systems that actually worked in real life, not just theory. I started outlining chapters that evening at my kitchen table, mapping out everything I'd learned about time management, task prioritization, and creating routines that stick. I worked on the outline during evenings and weekends, enjoying the creative process of organizing my thoughts into something other people could use. The second spousal support payment arrived in my account the following week, a large deposit that showed up exactly on schedule. I looked at the balance and made a decision I'd been thinking about for months. I booked a week-long trip to Italy by myself, choosing a small hotel in Rome with good reviews and a location near several museums. The flight left in 2 weeks, and I spent the time before departure setting up systems so my employees could handle everything while I was gone. I landed in Rome on a Tuesday morning and spent the next 7 days eating amazing food at small restaurants, visiting museums without rushing and walking through neighborhoods just because they looked interesting. Nobody needed me to manage their schedule or solve their problems. I took photos of things I liked, bought books from street vendors, and stayed out late because I didn't have to wake up early to make someone else's coffee. On my 4th day in Italy, I checked my email at a cafe and found a message from a literary agent. She'd heard me on the podcast talking about building my business and organizational systems, and she wanted to discuss the book I was writing. I read the email 3 times to make sure it was real, then scheduled a video call for the day after I returned home. The rest of the vacation felt different after that email. Like my life was expanding in directions I'd never imagined possible when I was serving tiramisu to my ex-mother-in-law. I flew back home on Sunday night and went straight to the office Monday morning. My employees had handled every client request perfectly while I was gone, which proved the systems I'd built worked even without me watching over everything. They'd documented their decisions in our shared project management tool, resolved 2 client emergencies on their own, and even signed a new client who'd contacted us through the website. I felt proud of them and relieved that I'd created a business that could function during my absence. The video call with the literary agent happened on Wednesday afternoon. She loved my outline and thought the book would sell well because there was a huge market for practical advice from someone who'd actually lived these experiences instead of just studying them. She offered to represent me right there on the call, and we spent an hour discussing publishing houses she wanted to approach. She started shopping the book proposal to publishers the following week, sending it to editors she knew would appreciate the combination of personal story and practical systems. I got the call about the book deal 3 weeks later while I was in a client meeting. I excused myself to take it in the hallway, and the agent told me a mid-sized publisher wanted to buy the book. The advance amount she mentioned made me gasp out loud, and I had to ask her to repeat it because I thought I'd misheard. She laughed and confirmed the number, which was more than I'd made in 2 years at my old part-time job. I called Pearl immediately after the agent call ended to ask her to review the contract before I signed anything. Pearl scheduled a meeting for the next day and went through every clause with me, explaining what each section meant, and negotiating 2 small changes with the publisher's legal team. My ex-husband heard about the book deal through the family network within days. He sent a message through Dimitri asking if he was in the book, and what I'd written about him. I told Dimitri to tell him the book wasn't about him at all. It was about the organizational systems I'd developed over years of managing complex schedules and households. He was just the person who made me realize I could turn those skills into a real business, nothing more than a starting point. The business kept growing while I worked on the book manuscript in the evenings. I hired a 3rd employee, someone with more experience than my first 2 hires who could help train new clients and develop advanced systems. We'd outgrown working from my apartment, so I rented a small office space in a building downtown with good parking and a conference room we could use for client meetings. The lease started on the 1st of the month, and we spent a weekend moving in furniture and setting up our workstations. Veronica came to our little opening party on Friday evening, bringing champagne and congratulating me on how far the business had come in less than a year. My employees brought snacks, and we spent 2 hours in the new office space, talking about future plans and celebrating everything we'd built together. The person I'd been dating for a few months asked me to dinner at their place the following week, and when I arrived, they'd cooked an actual meal instead of ordering takeout like we usually did. They'd set the table with real plates and napkins, not paper ones, and there were candles that weren't just for decoration. We ate slowly and talked about my business expansion plans, and they asked detailed questions about my systems and processes instead of glazing over like my ex-husband always had. They wanted to know how I'd built the client tracking spreadsheet and what made me decide to hire employees instead of staying solo. After dinner, they showed me the home office they'd reorganized using tips from our previous conversations, and I realized they'd actually listened to everything I'd said about workflow optimization. They asked if I'd help them set up a better filing system, but they meant working together on it, not me doing it while they watched TV. We spent 2 hours that night sorting their paperwork and setting up folders, and it felt completely different from the 8 years I'd spent managing my ex-husband's entire existence. This person wanted to learn the systems, not just benefit from them. The next morning, they sent me a photo of their organized desk, with a message thanking me for teaching them something useful, and I stared at that text for a full minute before I understood what I was feeling. I was falling for someone who saw my skills as impressive instead of convenient, who wanted to be capable alongside me instead of dependent on me. We started spending more time together after that, and every interaction reinforced this pattern of mutual respect that I'd never experienced in my marriage. They picked up organizational habits naturally, and sent me excited messages when they successfully planned their week, or remembered to prep meals in advance. 3 weeks later, I suggested they meet my ex-mother-in-law at one of our monthly coffee dates, and they agreed immediately without asking why I was still friendly with my ex's mother. We met at the usual cafe on a Saturday morning, and my ex-mother-in-law arrived early with a book she wanted to lend me. I introduced my partner using their first name, and explained we'd been seeing each other for a few months, and she smiled in a way that seemed genuinely pleased. She asked my partner questions about their work and interests. Normal, getting-to-know-you conversation that felt relaxed and natural. My partner mentioned they'd learned organizational systems from me, and joked about how much better their life had become since we started dating. My ex-mother-in-law laughed and said she wished her son had approached things that way instead of taking advantage. The 3 of us talked for over an hour about books and gardening and local restaurants, topics that had nothing to do with my ex-husband or the divorce. When my partner excused themselves to take a work call outside, my ex-mother-in-law reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She told me I looked lighter somehow, like I wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's life anymore, and I realized she was right. The constant tension I'd carried through my entire marriage had disappeared so gradually, I hadn't noticed it leaving. She said she was happy I'd found someone who appreciated me properly, and I thanked her for being the one person from that family who'd actually tried to understand. My partner came back inside and we finished our coffee, and when we left the cafe, my ex-mother-in-law hugged us both. 2 days later, Dimitri called me with news that sounded like he expected me to be upset. His brother had gotten engaged to his girlfriend after only 4 months of dating, and the family was surprised by how fast everything was moving. Dimitri explained it carefully, like he thought I might cry or get angry, but I found myself genuinely happy for my ex-husband if this woman was willing to teach him basic life skills. I told Dimitri that was great news and asked if she knew what she was getting into, and he laughed with obvious relief. He said she seemed very patient and had already helped his brother learn to cook 3 actual meals, which was 3 more than he'd known during our entire marriage. I asked Dimitri to congratulate them for me, and he promised to pass along the message. That weekend, I went shopping for a wedding gift that felt appropriately petty, but also practical. I found a set of organizational books about managing households and adult responsibilities, plus a gift certificate for a meal planning service that would teach them to grocery shop and cook efficiently. I wrapped everything nicely and dropped it off at Dimitri's house with a card congratulating them both. Dimitri texted me 3 days later saying they'd opened the gift together and actually laughed, understanding the joke but also appreciating the usefulness. His brother's fiancée apparently told Dimitri she thought it was perfect, and planned to use all of it. The third spousal support payment arrived in my bank account the following week, a substantial quarterly amount that I immediately started planning how to invest. I called Pearl to discuss options for putting the money to work, and she reminded me I had 9 more payments coming over the next 3 years. After that, I'd be completely financially independent of my ex-husband forever, no longer tied to him through money or legal obligations. We talked through investment strategies and retirement account contributions, and Pearl helped me set up automatic transfers so the money would start growing immediately. I hung up feeling satisfied that I was building real financial security instead of just spending the support payments on daily expenses. The book manuscript had been consuming my evenings for months, and I finally typed the last sentence of the first draft on a Tuesday night around 11. I saved the file 3 times to make sure it was backed up, then sent it to my editor with a message saying I'd finished. Writing the book had been therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected when I started, helping me process everything that happened and recognize how much I'd grown. Seeing my experiences laid out in chapters made me understand patterns I'd missed while living through them. The editor responded the next morning saying she'd start reading immediately and would send feedback within 2 weeks. My business had grown to the point where I needed to make a real decision about its future direction. I could keep it small and manageable with my current 5 employees, or I could scale up significantly and take on bigger corporate clients. I scheduled a meeting with my business coach to talk through the options, and she helped me see that strategic growth made more sense than staying comfortable. We spent 3 hours mapping out a hiring plan that would add 2 more employees over the next 6 months, plus the systems and training I'd need to implement. I left that meeting feeling excited about expanding instead of scared, confident that I'd built something strong enough to grow without falling apart. The speaking invitation arrived via email 2 weeks later from a women's business conference happening in 3 months. They wanted me to give a 40-minute talk about building a company from scratch, and they'd cover my travel expenses plus pay a speaking fee. I accepted immediately and started preparing the presentation, focusing on practical advice instead of inspirational platitudes. The conference happened on a Saturday in a hotel ballroom with about 200 women in the audience. I stood on that stage talking about my journey from invisible household manager to business owner, and halfway through I realized I'd become the person I needed when I was serving tiramisu to my ex-mother-in-law. The audience asked thoughtful questions afterward about systems and client management, and several women approached me during the break to share their own stories. My ex-husband's wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in early June, and Dimitri sent me the invitation more out of courtesy than actual expectation I'd attend. I declined politely and didn't think much about it because I was too busy planning my book launch party for the same weekend. The publisher had scheduled the official release for that Friday, and I'd rented a small event space to celebrate with clients, employees, and friends. On Saturday evening, I spent the week before handling final details for the launch party and doing media interviews about the book. The book released on Friday morning, and I watched the reviews start appearing online throughout the day. Several reviewers specifically mentioned how refreshing it was to read practical advice from someone who wasn't pretending life was perfect or easy, and the ratings stayed consistently high. My publisher called that afternoon to say the first printing was selling faster than expected, and they were already ordering a second run. The launch party on Saturday night filled the event space with people who'd supported me through the divorce and business building, and I gave a short speech thanking everyone for being part of this journey. Someone asked if I was sad about missing my ex-husband's wedding happening across town, and I realized I'd completely forgotten it was the same day until they mentioned it. The publisher arranged the book tour for the following month, 8 cities over 2 weeks with bookstore events and speaking engagements at each stop. I flew to Boston first, then New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Denver, Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco, talking about organizational systems and business building at every venue. The audiences were mostly women, and after each event at least a dozen would wait in line not just for book signatures, but to tell me their own stories. One woman in Chicago told me she'd been managing her husband's dental practice for 15 years without pay or credit, while he told people he was self-made. Another in Denver said she'd been writing all her husband's reports and presentations for his marketing job while he got promoted 3 times. In Portland, a woman showed me texts from her boyfriend asking her to schedule his dentist appointments and order his groceries because he was too busy with work, the same work she was helping him complete on weekends. By the time I reached San Francisco for the final event, I understood I'd accidentally started something bigger than a book about getting organized. These women weren't just looking for tips on managing calendars and creating systems, they were looking for permission to stop being invisible engines in someone else's life. Back home, I made the decision to keep my business at its current size instead of expanding into the corporate consulting world. 5 employees felt manageable. The client list included some impressive names from tech and finance, and the revenue had grown to the point where I was making more annually than my ex-husband ever had in his best year. It took me less than 2 years to build something that paid better and felt infinitely more satisfying than 8 years of managing his entire existence for free. My partner and I found an apartment together in a neighborhood between both our workplaces, and before we signed the lease, I insisted we sit down and map out every household responsibility in a shared spreadsheet. They laughed at first, thinking I was joking, but when they saw I was serious, they pulled out their laptop and we spent 2 hours dividing up cooking, cleaning, grocery shopping, bill paying, and even social calendar management. They said they understood why this mattered to me now, why I needed everything explicit instead of assumed, and they were completely supportive of building our home life as actual partners instead of one person carrying the other. A year after the divorce was finalized, I sat in my office looking at the client files organized on my desk, the employee schedule posted on the wall, the framed book cover hanging beside my business license, and the life I'd designed entirely on my own terms, without asking anyone's permission or managing anyone's incompetence. My ex-mother-in-law called that afternoon to tell me she was proud of me, that watching me build all this had inspired her to make changes in her own life, and I realized while listening to her that I was proud of me too. The help doesn't work here anymore, and honestly, she never should have had to.